So that's where this part of the theory ends, but don't think that this is the end of the guide's story. The guide escapes beneath the ruins and secretly has been traveling around the various Flood Escape 2 maps for the past years, but I won't spoil that theory just yet.
Hello internet! Welcome to Flood Theory, the show that I definitely did not stay up to 3 AM trying to write. In the last episode, we talked about Crazyblox's biggest failure. His dark side facility became a biological hazard after a virus drawn from Poisonous Valley was planted into it by a familiar blue tuxedo wearing fellow on his quest for vengeance. In this episode, we will uncover the truth about what the guide has been doing since the destruction of Flood Escape. But believe me when I say that he is not the hero we all thought he was. In episode 1 of Flood Theory, we covered the destruction of Flood Escape due to a catastrophic explosion involving a volcanic eruption, because Crazyblox abandoned the facility. The facility wasn't fully abandoned though. The guide was left trapped inside. The guide looked around at his situation. He sat down on a table with a paper on it that read Flood Escape 2. Crazyblox had left him to die. He was trapped below a crumbling facility with the conditions only getting worse by the minute. He thought this would be the end. Alone and forgotten. And not just a facility, but his home that he loved for so many years. He sat there as he thought about everything he'd been through. Helping the players of Flood Escape. Being close friends with Crazyblox. And then escaping death. Then he decided this isn't how he was going to let his story end, and drew his Flood Sword. The Flood Sword is a powerful weapon that was used to fight opponents in the now destroyed Flood Gauntlet. With the paper in one hand and his Flood Sword in the other, the guide carved his own way out of the ruins, dragging the table behind him. Cautiously, painfully, and slowly, the guide dug through the layers of the facility, dulling his blade in his attempt to escape. Once he reached the surface of the ocean, he used the table as a raft until he could get to land, urged on by only his hatred of Crazyblox. Upon reaching land, he trudged along until he came across a valley that contained a hidden laboratory. The lab was long abandoned, but he found that it contained many vials that had samples of some virus, the dark side virus. He stumbled across a book as well, that had an image of a Flood Sword, which only led to one single conclusion. Crazyblox had been here. Perhaps this was the original lab where Flood Escape was developed before Crazyblox moved his operations to Darkside Facility. The book contained all the information he needed to know about his Flood Sword. The guide scoured every inch of the lab, consuming all the knowledge that it contained, determining that he would use this valley to help him conduct further tests of the virus. The guide would use the valley as the testing grounds for his virus, slowly infecting each portion of it until he ran out of room, being forced to move even further to a nearby forest and chasm. After his testing with the virus was complete, he enacted his plan of sabotaging Crazyblox's work at his Darkside facility, releasing the virus into the lab and shutting down his work. After he accomplished this, he moved to his next goal, repairing his Flood Sword. Now this whole thing may seem like a massive reach in logic, but the game provides proof for all of this. In Beneath the Ruins, we see the guide at a specific table. This same table appears in both Poisonous Valley and Sunken Citadel, implying that he took it with him on his journey. We also know that the Flood Escape facility is located in the middle of an ocean, meaning that the table would be used as a flotation device of some sorts. The tampering of Poisonous Valley is clearly apparent in the game, with broken vials littered across the map containing the same viral substance. We already covered the nature of this virus in the last episode, so I won't get into it here. And I'm sure we all know the guide secret in Poisonous Valley, but for those who don't, the guide can be found in a hidden room in the map, pouring the very same virus into the water, cementing his role in the experimentation and tampering with the valley. Also in this room, the same table from Beneath the Ruins can be seen with a broken Flood Sword and a book on the table with an arrow pointing to the tip of the Flood Sword. Next, the guide's journey carried him to buried Oasis, but why would he go here of all places? Well, it was actually to repair his Flood Sword. To explain why, I need to go into a bit of meta knowledge about Buried Oasis and the Flood Sword. What some of you may not know is that Buried Oasis is actually based off the Sunken Sea biome from the Terraria Calamity mod. One of the materials that can be harvested from the Sunken Sea is an item called Sea Prisms. Are you starting to notice the connections? Sea prisms have a lot of uses, however they are frequently used in the creation of weapons. Notably, among these for our theory today are, you guessed it, swords. It's blatantly evident just by looking at the sea prisms and the flood sword that they are of the same material, thus explaining the guide going to Buried Oasis to get sea prisms to repair his flood sword. As he delved deeper into Buried Oasis, he encountered a Sunken Citadel. The guide can be found in a secret room near the end of Sunken Citadel with a bulletin board containing pictures of the significant locations he'd been to, with the same table from before and the same paper reading Flood Escape 2. And guess what else is there? A crate full of sea prisms. This is the very same crate that can be found in Buried Oasis. Take note that this crate is the only one of its kind that can be found in Buried Oasis, and likewise for Sunken Citadel. After some time and repairing of the sword, the guide continues on his quest and ascends back to Buried Oasis. One thing that I failed to mention earlier is that Buried Oasis is underneath, or at least in the same desert as Sandswept Ruins. Don't believe me? The very definition of Oasis is a fertile spot in the desert where water is found. And we can literally see that this oasis is buried. Need further proof? I earlier said that Buried Oasis is based off the Sunken Sea biome from the Terraria Calamity mod. The Sunken Sea biome is found in only a single location no matter what. It's always beneath a desert. And the final bit of proof is that the next location that the guide goes is Sandswept Ruins. But what made the guide stay in this harsh environment? The dangerous and collapsed sections of the temple, coupled with the hot sand, serve as a natural barrier against potential intruders. He chose this location because it provides a level of secrecy and isolation, making it a perfect place to plan and prepare his next move without attracting attention. Meanwhile, back in Flood Escape 2. Flood Escape 2 would release to the public, with Crazyblox including the essence of his failures in the maps. Familiar ruins, beneath the ruins, Darkside Forest, Darkside Facility, all monuments to the mistakes of his past. As the years went by, he would pour more of his past into the maps. Poisonous Valley, Buried Oasis, Sunken Citadel, Sandswept Ruins. With the explosion of popularity in Flood Escape 2, Crazyblox required assistance. Thus, he enlisted the help of alternate guides to work in the shop. All seemed well, and Flood Escape 2 was the success that Crazyblox always dreamed it would be. However, he soon caught wind of what the guide was doing. He'd seen the guide's infection, learned of the implanted Darkside virus, and he deduced that the guide was looking for him. He feared the shopkeepers would end up the same way, so he abandoned them. They had nowhere to go, and nowhere to call home. During the guide's travels, he discovered these mistreated guides, and he knew they were his only lead in finding Crazyblox. On top of this, they all had something in common. Crazyblox abandoned all of them. After spending lots of time with each other and much preparation, the mistreated guides led the former guide to Flood Escape 2. Yet Crazyblox was nowhere to be found. The guide's only thought at this point was to cause collateral damage by attacking the players of Flood Escape 2. As he attacked the players in the lobby, years of resentment and bitterness culminating in a moment of pure, unapologetic evil. He would make Crazyblox feel what it felt like to lose everything. And in that moment, the guide became a killer. He looked around at the Flood Escape 2 lobby, remembering his past back at Flood Escape all those years ago, reminiscing on all the good times he had teaching the players how to win Flood Escape. He then saw his own reflection in the water, and saw what he had become, a monster consumed by hate. The guide left behind the alternate guides, never again looking upon their faces. He left the lobby and was again on his own. But this time, he didn't have anger plaguing his soul. His journey was now of self-reflection, an attempt to escape the atrocities of his past. His atrocities. His murders. His long journey brought him to a lumber mill in the north, Adler Lumber Works. It was a recluse mill in the north that was a perfect place for him to hide. unaware of the hidden operations that lay below. It was here that the guide would write his last message to the world. I was given a second chance after the incident at the facility. I wanted to be strong. I needed to survive. So I've committed sin after sin. And when I decided to stop, I ended up letting go of someone I really cared about. Because I was too selfish. The guide left his hat and sword in the room, signifying him leaving it all behind. And that's where the guide's story ends. Whoa! Now I know this might seem crazy, but let me break it all down. We know at some point the guide meets the shopkeepers that were in Flood Escape 2's lobby. They were removed from the game in 2019 and never seen again until 2023. Now I think this is a good time to bring up Northern Mill. You may have been wondering, where has the guide ever been seen in Northern Mill? Well, a few months ago, a user on Discord who wished to remain anonymous used exploits to see the inner workings of Northern Mill and took screenshots of what they found. The guide's final notes to the world. And in one of the Polaroids, you can see the guide surrounded by those same shopkeepers. The alternate guides. We also know that the guide has to be in the lobby at some point. In December of 2022, the guide's flood sword and hat could be found at the bottom of the pool in the lobby, but then they quickly vanished in the next update. The guide could also be seen in the lift on the menu screen before it was removed. So the only sensible explanation for the guide meeting the shopkeepers is that they were thrown out by Crazyblox and met up. And now for the largest lore drop in Flood Escape 2 history, Northern Mill. From the outside, it may just seem like Northern Mill is a regular normal map, but it's anything but that. Northern Mill single-handedly gave us the largest lore drop in Flood Escape 2 history. As I stated earlier, Northern Mill has a secret with the guide's notes, which you can only fully see from exploiting. The room can be found in-game by doing this. The guide writes, "I was given a second chance after the incident at the facility," obviously referring to the destruction of Flood Escape and him having a second chance after escaping. This is made even more clear as the quote is paired with a Polaroid of him in Beneath the Ruins. "I wanted to be strong. I needed to survive." Referring to him always saying strong, repairing the flood sword, helping the shopkeepers, and doing his best to survive. So I've committed sin after sin. This is referring to him poisoning the valley, planting the Darkside virus, and murdering the players of Flood Escape 2. The Polaroid paired with this quote has him dragging his flood sword behind him, which is typically used in media before or after a character has committed an atrocity. Sin after sin. All to get revenge on Crazyblox. And when I decided to stop, his reflection, literally reflecting upon himself, is what caused him to stop. He had to do something so evil, so heinous, to justify him calling it a sin, and to make him realize that he has taken this way too far. This evidence paired with us knowing that he's been in the lobby is how I reached the conclusion that the guide committed murder. I ended up letting go of someone I really cared about. Notice how cared is in past tense. After the destruction of Flood Escape and his abandonment, he obviously lost his care for Crazyblox because I was too selfish. After his abandonment, he only thought about himself without taking into consideration the players of Flood Escape 2 or Crazyblox. All the events of his life led to deep conflict within him, being torn apart by the ideals of his past and his possible future. All of this culminating in his decision to leave everything behind. And that's where the guide story ends. For now. I do believe that the guide could come back into play at some point in the future, but for now, his current story ends. The guide is definitely the most interesting character to analyze in the Flood Escape games. He started as just a guide, helping the players of Flood Escape. He had little significance to anything really, but that all changed when the Flood Escape facility was destroyed. He experienced trauma of being trapped, alone, being left to die, so he fought. spreading the viral poison throughout 3 large landmasses, planting the very same virus in the middle of Crazyblox's operations, saving the other guides Crazyblox abandoned, then becoming a cold-blooded killer. The guide is a deeply conflicted character, but it's hard not to root for him, even if he committed atrocities. The story of Flood Escape has presented a surprisingly nuanced conflict, with neither side being in the clear right. The guide nor Crazyblox are correct here. But hey, remember, that's just a theory, a flood theory, and